Hitchens. According to a new poll, twice as many British adults support legalising cannabis than oppose it. But what about harder drugs? It was revealed this week that Scotland recorded in excess of 1,100 drug-related deaths last year. That's a rise of 27%. And that's more than any other country in Europe and the highest since records began. Well, the problems north of the border have led to calls to decriminalise drug use and stop treating addicts as criminals. So, should drug users be treated as having a health problem or punished for breaking the law? Joining me to explore these issues are journalist Peter Hitchens, co-founder of Recovering Justice, Fiona Gilbertson, community activist Simeon Moore, and lawyer Michael Phillips of Christian Concern. Well, Fiona, a YouGov poll suggests that attitudes towards drugs are softening, but then we see that rate of deaths because of drugs in Scotland rising. Shouldn't we be tougher and harder on drugs?
We can't be tougher on drugs. They're an inanimate object. What we are is we're tough on people who use drugs, and specifically certain groups of people who use drugs. Poor people who use drugs, people who have no homes, and people who have issues, childhood trauma issues, and we're criminalising those people.
So, Peter, we're criminalising people who really need help.
Well, I'd like to agree with Fiona on one thing. Rich people who use drugs are certainly not pursued by the police as they should be. And there is an imbalance there which I'd be all in favour of correcting. I'd love to see lots of rich drug users being prosecuted for possession. But then again, I'd like to see all drug users being prosecuted for possession, because that's the best approach that we could possibly have. It works very well in Japan and South Korea. It keeps down drug use. All the problems of drugs arise from the fact that people start taking them. If you don't deter people from starting to take them, then drug use rises, as it has done in this country since we abandoned serious enforcement probably 40 years ago. The idea that people are being criminalised, which is a ridiculous phrase anyway, since breaking the criminal law criminalises yourself. The idea that people are being subjected to a vicious prohibition in this country by serious enforcement is absurd. The recent announcements by Police Scotland reveal a tiny number of people are actually being prosecuted for drug abuse. So whatever the cause of Scotland's problems may be, it is not the fact that the law against drug abuse is being seriously pursued.
Okay. So, Simeon, you've been involved in buying and selling drugs in the past. Do you agree with that? We need to be tougher?
Yeah, definitely not. First and foremost, being tougher on it is not going to solve the issue. Neither is it going to help it or cut it down. People have been going to jail for selling drugs and using drugs since I was born, and there hasn't been no positive outcome from it. I think first we need to remember why people use drugs in the first place. People use drugs as a way to escape from their life, from the poor environment that many of us are placed in, and they use drugs as an escape. So I think it should be decriminalised. I think cannabis should definitely be legalised, just because I think there's more medicinal use of it than anything else. And I would say that alcohol kills more people than cannabis every single year. But it's okay for us to drink alcohol.
Okay. We'll get on to cannabis a little bit later on. I mean, Michael, as a Christian, you must have compassion for the people that Simeon is talking about, that they need help and they don't need to be banged up in prison.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think you're right. That as a Christian, you have to love these people. You have to give them the appropriate treatment and the appropriate help. And I wouldn't necessarily advocate, and the drug Christian rehabilitation centres that I've been in contact with over the years, and that I know do not support decriminalisation. However, what they do say is there has to be a difference in the sentencing approach that we take in this country. That, for example, if you complete the courses in a number of the rehab centres around the country, like Bethel, you have at least a 75%, sometimes a 95% chance of staying off drugs for the rest of your life as a result of going on their programmes, which are about a year in length. Whereas, unfortunately, with the probation service, they try as best as they can, but their failure rate is pretty phenomenal. It's maybe about 99% of those people who go on to drug rehabilitation requirement orders don't succeed.
But why are we talking about it in the probation service? What about what Simeon and Fiona are saying, and actually get people before they go into prison and give them a proper rehabilitation from drugs?
The problem is that before you get into that situation, those people probably won't come onto the radar. Some people self-refer, and those people do often quite well. But generally speaking, the people who come into the system, we would suggest that what needs to happen is that there needs to be, in the criminal justice system, a way that people can be told prison isn't the answer. going into a therapeutic community where you can receive the help and the love that you need in order to overcome your problems, your trauma and so on, is the best way forward.
There's an illusion here that people who are caught in possession of drugs, supposedly hard drugs, such as heroin or cannabis, and in fact cannabis is just as hard as heroin and does terrible damage to the human mind and creates serious mental illness in its users, the people who are caught in possession of these drugs are put in prison, and that somehow this gets in the way of rehabilitation. They're not put in prison. Most of them are not even prosecuted. There's hardly anybody in the prisons of this country for simple possession of drugs. It isn't true. There has been, in this country, a de facto decriminalisation of the kind which the Daily Record ignorantly called for many years. The Police Scotland alone let off 500 people a month for marijuana offences, and that's those they bother to notice at all. Okay. If they're anything like the British police, they simply don't bother to notice most use of this drug, which is why the streets of most British cities stink of it.
OK, Fiona, I'll get your response
it's
to that in a moment.
It's simply not true that people
Peter,
are put in prison for taking
yeah,
drugs. It's
let's
a
let
fantasy.
people at home respond on social media. Ria, what's happening?
Love it if they do.
Lots of opinions online today. Paul's got in touch via Facebook to say, people know what they're doing when they take drugs, so we should have no qualms about locking them up and making them go cold turkey. Joy said they are not criminals. People take drugs because of peer pressure, socio-economic problems, lack of education and not having any prospects. What is rarely mentioned is the amount of rich people who take cocaine and alcohol. Neil said on Facebook, legalising cannabis will not make the problem go away. The dealers will just move on to selling other drugs like heroin and cocaine. And Graham's texted in from Bradford saying, give drug addicts pure drugs on a prescription. That way crime could go down. Peter's said on Facebook, cannabis will never be legalised. It's easy to grow and the government won't make any money from people growing their own, unlike alcohol. And Gail has said, the decriminalisation of drugs should never be the answer. Ultimately, if a person wants to use them, they need to be aware that they are taking a gamble with their life.
Ria, thank you. Fiona, I want to get you to respond to Peter there. So, I mean, he's saying that people aren't arrested for possession. There's no one in jail arrested for possession. There's bigger things. Should they be arrested for possession? And do you agree with what he's saying?
I question this whole debate. We're sitting here today. Today is the International Remembrance Day for drug users. We have lost thousands and thousands of lives across the world. Scotland has now become the drugs capital of Europe, and you're asking questions about criminality instead of about safety and evidence-based solutions. Madam Ruth Dreyfus introduced heroin-assisted treatment in Switzerland. It was an extremely brave move. She was asked to criminalise those citizens, and instead she said, my job as a Prime Minister is to listen to every member of my society. She brought them all into a room and created heroin-assisted treatment. Nobody's ever died in a heroin-assisted treatment facility.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever become infected with a blood-borne virus. We in Scotland now have an outbreak of HIV among people who have nowhere to use drugs except the streets. And you're asking a question about criminalisation.
So, Simeon, I'll come to you in a second. Michael, when you think about that it's people are dying, and the way Fiona puts it, you know, there are lots of people dying, lots of families affected, and actually, one of the comments that we had there, if the drugs were legal, then they would be safer, and many of the points that Fiona said. How would you respond?
What I'd say is this, is that the people who take the drugs, if, for example, you legalise those drugs, very often they will shift between drug to drug to drug. So it isn't necessarily the drug which is the problem, but it's the underlying trauma very often that people have experienced in childhood, which has led them into a lifestyle whereby they maybe use alcohol, then they say that they're clean, and then they move on to cocaine, and then they get off there and they revert.
Prison is the answer, is it?
I'm not saying that for one second.
Giving them safe
but what I'd say is this, is that...
safe drugs.
No, but I think that Christian rehabilitation in a therapeutic community is statistically, unarguably, probably the best solution for those people, rather than leaving them in the town centres and continuing to take heroin and so on.
The UN would disagree.
Let's hear from Simeon here.
The UN would disagree.
I'm going to say prison literally does not solve anything. It doesn't help to deal with any crimes whatsoever. I've been in prison 7 times, or maybe 6, I can't remember, and it has never helped me to come away from crime. That's number one. Number two, in 2005, I was arrested with a small amount of heroin. I went to jail So, yes, you can go to prison for possession. I went to jail for possession. How long was I in there? I was in for about 4 months. Then I was let out on a deal, on an order, where I had to do some drugs work and that. So people are
First
being
offence?
It's not my first offence,
No,
but that
it wasn't.
doesn't matter. But people are still being put... What you're saying is people don't go to prison for possession. I know a lot of
Simple
people... I
possession
know a
is the
lot
first
of
offence, no,
people
they don't.
that have been to jail for possession of
Can I
Class
just
A.
make a
Okay,
point? Because
Peter.
they have a point about prison, which you're missing. And one of the
Well, this isn't a debate about
the
prison,
problem
that's
about
right.
prison in this country is that almost nobody goes there until they're already hardened criminal. You have to probably commit about 50 offences and have 20 of them noticed by the police before you ever go. In Japan and South Korea, where people are punished systematically in proper disciplined prisons run by the authorities for drug possession is far lower than in the major Western countries. These are advanced, law-governed democracies. They have tackled the drug problem. They have far less drug abuse than we do, and their example is persistently ignored
Peter,
and
The
even
UN
derided
you could use
by
any
people in this
country. What about Portugal?
Yeah, Portugal.
What about
Switzerland.
Portugal? You want to discuss Portugal? Portugal, what is it you want to tell me about?
What about
Port-
Holland
well,
as well?
If you were caught with drugs in Portugal, you can have your passport taken away, you can have your profession taken away, your licence to practice it, you can be fined, you can be
Fiona,
banned,
okay, Fiona.
from going to nightclubs.
Portugal-
And what's more...
Yeah.
Portugal decriminalised drugs.
No, they didn't.
60% of
It's not
the
true.
money that they saved in the criminal justice system went to education.
Okay.
And
Before the
40%
Portuguese reform, there were
Peter,
21 people in the
Peter,
whole of Portugal for
and that
drug
is all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Really good points.
I know about
Thank you for all your contributions, even you, Peter. Well, Ria...